Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Timothy Done. I am a faculty member at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and co-facilitator of the Conflict and Security Research Cluster. And this is our inaugural event of the academic year, focused on, appropriately enough, the current situation in Afghanistan, given the dramatic events there that have unfolded over the recent days and weeks. We have a 90-minute session this morning. We have a distinguished panel of experts with long experience and expertise in Afghanistan. And we'll be asking our panelists to reflect over the next 90 minutes or so on what has happened in Afghanistan over the past 20 days, more or less, since the Taliban rolled unopposed into Kabul, but also over the past 20 years in terms of the larger project to remake Afghanistan in the aftermath of 9/11. So essentially, we're asking three sets of related questions this morning, it seems to me. The first is around the question, and this is partly coming out of the title of our panel this morning, of what went wrong. The United States alone has poured some $2 trillion into Afghanistan over the past 20 years. There will be a lot of lessons learned exercises over the next years and months. And one of the questions will be, has this money all been for naught, and how could it have been done differently? The second question is what comes next in Afghanistan, and particularly for Afghans. A lot of people are asking whether the clock has just been set back to August 2001, before 9/11, before the Taliban was overthrown, especially around the front questions of women's rights. Or alternately, is the situation different now than it was in 2001 in terms of the domestic context for Taliban rule? And the third set of questions is really around, what does it all mean? Larger questions of geopolitics, for the lessons that should be taken from Afghanistan around the future of peace building, state building, for liberal internationalism, also for the politics of the wider region, as well as for the US role in the world. And of course, it is not a coincidence, and many of you will have noted that this session comes on the eve of the 20th anniversary of 9/11. So we have lots to cover in the next 90 minutes or so, but also lots of expertise in the room that will help us work through at least some of these questions, if not provide definitive answers to it. So let me briefly introduce our panelists, and then we'll get started. Let me start with Sally Armstrong. Many of you will know Sally Armstrong, who is an award-winning journalist, author, and human rights advocate, long-standing champion of the rights of girls and women, not only in Afghanistan, but globally. And also an officer of the Order of Canada for her advocacy work and her journalism work. So Sally, thank you and for taking the time to be with us this morning, and welcome. Next is Syed Ali Hosseini, who is a PhD candidate at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, so one of ours. Ali's dissertation focuses on the socio-cultural dimensions of peace building in Afghanistan. So he's been looking at these issues very closely over the past number of years. Ali is also a former human rights officer with the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, and also, I believe, a former lecturer in law at the university level. And just as importantly, this session was actually his idea. So Ali, thank you for the inspiration to organize this session this morning. Next is Mark Sedra, also well known at the Balsillie School, where he's an adjunct faculty member. Mark is also the founder and executive director of the Center for Security Governance, based here in Waterloo, And for the purposes of this panel, he is also a very veteran observer of Afghanistan's security sector. Mark warned as early as 2006 in an article about security sector reform in Afghanistan that there was a slide towards expediency. And I think we've seen the consequences of that over the past month. And finally, let me introduce Jalal Banish, who is a graduate of the Master in International Public Policy program at the Balsillie School, and is currently a PhD candidate at Ryerson University. Jalal also has long experience in Afghanistan, and most recently was the director of the Kabul-based human rights NGO Afghanistan Watch. Jalil and I had long conversations when he was at the Balsillie School about talking to the Taliban. So it's interesting in the new context what that might look like going forward. So with that as introductions, let me just say by way of housekeeping that audience members are free to submit questions through the Q&A function over the course of the session. As I said, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak, starting with Sally, for no more than 10 minutes, which will provide 45 or 50 minutes of discussion at the end. So with that, thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to pass the mic to Sally, please.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And it's a pretty heavy topic we're taking on this morning, and I'm delighted to be part of it. Because, you know, as these events unfolded, I couldn't help but think that in 1 year, the scientists found a vaccine to save all the people in the whole world if they wanted the vaccine. But in 20 years and more than $1 trillion, the politicians could not find the path to peace in Afghanistan. And as a journalist who's been covering Afghanistan ever since the Taliban took over September 26, 1996, and continuing to cover Afghanistan, I have to ask, are we looking for peace in the wrong places? So that's something I'd like to come back to in a moment. As for the things that went wrong in this 20-year period, one of them has to be the misinformation. For example, especially in the last few weeks, there's been such a lot of talk about the Americans occupying Afghanistan. The Americans are not occupying Afghanistan. They never were. I think we get very caught up in the wonderful, well-written stories about the British occupying and the Russians occupying. What happened, we have to remember, is that after 9/11, the Americans pushed the NATO button. Article 5 in NATO says, all for one, one for all. If we've been attacked, we expect our colleagues in NATO to come with us to avenge. And what they wanted to do, the Americans, in calling on Article 5 in NATO, was they wanted to find Osama bin Laden as the mastermind of the attack. They wanted to dismantle al-Qaeda as the jihadis who carried out the attack. And they wanted to get rid of the Taliban, which was the government of the time in Afghanistan that gave training ground for terrorists. That was the goal of the invasion of Afghanistan. And what brought the world to Afghanistan and to stay in Afghanistan was as they came in to find al-Qaeda and bin Laden and dismantle the Taliban, they tripped over these burqa-clad women and found out that girls weren't allowed to go to school and women weren't allowed to go to work, and the whole country was upside down, and then decided to stay and assist with nation building. And I think that's a very plain but very accurate description of how this began. However, after that invasion, October the 7th, 2001, I think Afghanistan became a petri dish for international intervention. We saw what happened. We filled our newspapers and our broadcasts with schools reopening and businesses starting up and women being brought back into the fold and human rights being introduced at every corner. And the world brought institutions, governances, ideas to people who were hardworking, long-suffering, and wanting this kind of change. And in the process, to all the people who have been talking for the last several weeks about the great failure of the 20 years, we have to remember that during that 20 years, life expectancy in Afghanistan went from 47 years to 63 years. That's almost a miracle. And maternal mortality dropped by 50%. And the women did become governors and lawyers and teachers and members of the community. And the girls who we saw, these little kids being so tormented by the Taliban, they grew up to be, well, I'm thinking of the ones I've interviewed, orchestra leaders and Olympians and scholars. A lot happened that was good and that was right. But indeed, it began to unravel. ISIS appeared. And in Afghanistan, the Afghan people refer to ISIS, ISKP, because they come from Khorasan province. But ISIS arrived with their horrible suicide bombing techniques, and things began to dismantle. Discontented jihadis from all over the world, whose goal is to disrupt government, joined them. By 2014, most of the military from around the world had left. And then this otherwise flagging Taliban started to ramp up their offensive. But for me, the worst part was when the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, decided to negotiate with the Taliban, and he made them look like the victors of the 20-year insurgency. And I thought that was a tremendous error, because you know, when you're given the victor's mantle, it does pump you up. Some pundits say that COVID-19 was like an X-ray that showed everything that's broken. And I dare say we can apply that same thinking to the intervention in Afghanistan, because the same thing happened in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in South Sudan, in Iraq, in Sarajevo. All of these are conflicts that I covered. And our massive expenditure of blood and treasure from the international community simply does not get the results that we all wanted. And I say we when I speak for the international community, not as a journalist, because what happens is terrorists don't lose. ISIS doesn't lose. Taliban, they didn't lose. Boko Haram didn't lose. Al-Shabaab didn't lose. And what they do is they go back to their lairs and plan their next round and surface again, usually, by the way, with women and girls as their targets. United Nations didn't defeat them. The long-suffering people of Afghanistan didn't defeat them, and the droves of humanitarian aid workers and indeed investors couldn't defeat them. So for me, the monumental effort in Afghanistan was defeated by tribalism, by warlords, by insurgents, by political opportunists, and a bizarre truth that we don't like to face, and that is that the international community invariably fails to find the path to peace in the places we go, even though the X-rays show us where the fractures are. I believe it's time we had a roundtable to bring people together to discuss how to find that path to peace in a country that perhaps is tribal or perhaps is quite primitive, because we're investing a huge amount and we're not getting the results that we should be getting. And accusing foreigners of being occupiers is first of all untrue and bogus. And I think it's a waste of everybody's time. We know very well what the formula for success is in any country. It's equal opportunity, it's safety, and it's justice. And that means bringing in human rights, and it means getting rid of the corruption. But instead, you know, we go along with these appeasements. We hear deals being made that we know won't work. And then we want to blame people for not reforming quickly enough to meet our standards. Even President Biden kind of suggested that that if the Afghan soldiers ran away, did the Afghan people not bring disaster on their own backs? I think that's a terribly simple excuse for turning our backs on 38 million people. So briefly, what's next? Well, the Taliban can't govern. Experts say the economy will collapse in a short time, and a humanitarian crisis is already on the way because more than half the country is dependent on food aid. The airport is closed, so that is not going to be delivered. Sounds like a recipe for catastrophe. And for the women, that catastrophe has already begun because as the Taliban arrived village to village, they wanted a list of girls over the age of 15 and widows under the age of 44. Why? Because each of their fighters are entitled to 4 women. They claim God told them to do that. And we don't argue back very heavily on those kinds of things. I can also tell you my inbox is stuffed with video of girls being whipped by the Taliban. And these grown men stand in a circle around a girl who's on her knees, and they whip her, and then they hand the whip to the next guy to take his turn. And she's screaming for mercy. These are the people that now we should be making a deal with to govern. So what's going to happen? Well, civil war, maybe, because the Panshiris are certainly fighting back. And will others join them? That's one possible scenario. Will the international community cobble together a deal to open the airport, deliver the food, and somehow keep the Taliban running some sort of government and whipping little girls? Or will the warlords and the tribal chiefs come together, as they always have, and said, we're not allowing you to govern? It's very difficult to govern a country when you have warlords and tribal chiefs against the programs you're trying to bring in. So there's a lot that can happen in Afghanistan, but I'll conclude by saying there is an ace here for all of us to consider. 65% of the population of Afghanistan is under the age of 25. These kids never suffered under the Taliban. The universities are stuffed with them. They see tomorrow and they have big plans for themselves, and they might just be the ace to turn this place around again. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. As you said, it's a heavy topic, but I'm glad you ended on a somewhat optimistic note, at least. Anyway, let me turn to Ali. Please, Ali, go ahead. For 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. And also, I want to build on what Sally said. Very good general cover of the issues in the past and present, and some reflection, prediction about the future. I want to say that many things went wrong in Afghanistan in many directions. And this sad, unexpected collapse of the government and institutions, including security institutions, indicate that this sandcastle actually was not real. Many things was wrong. I want to focus on the issue of corruption and legitimacy, and also instrumentalist view of peace builders in Afghanistan. Corruption, for me, corruption has been a cancer in Afghanistan. It started from the beginning of nation-state building or peace building in Afghanistan, neglected by mostly foreign founders, and the foreigners have been supporting the government not only financially and militarily, but also with human resources and expertise. So this was a big mistake that grew up and gradually delegitimize the government and institutions, and give some legitimacy to Taliban and insurgent groups who, for example, on cases of judicial processing and things like this, have been more quick and less corrupt than government, especially in rural areas. So corruption has been a big problem. It was. There have many articles, papers, books about corruption and peace building, and even in Afghanistan. But I want to say that corruption was not only about corruption in the Afghan government, but also corruption in the international side of peacebuilding, and also in civil society in some different way. So this issue actually can be a subject of debate or reflection, considering other situations. Sally rightfully said that violent fundamentalist groups are growing and have not been defeated, not in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq, but also in North Africa, whole region. And there can be a debate why they still are there and are not defeated against the goodwill of many citizens in those countries, many activists, human rights activists, women activists, journalists, political activists, many good people among them, and against all of the treasure and blood that is spent on building a sustainable states in this region. So I say that the corruption has been a big problem, delegitimizing not only the government, but also international presence. In recent years, Sigar, the special investigator general in Afghanistan, US, just mandated by US Senate to oversee and report on corruption and mismanagement or misuse of US resources spent in Afghanistan, usually and regularly produce reports indicating how many how much dollar actually spent like without any justification or use or misuse, or in some cases embezzled. You see different forms of corruption in those reports. Some of them are mind-boggling. $500 million contract to build Afghan Air Force and buy aircraft for Afghan forces goes to scrap and sold out as pieces of iron for $40,000. It is a mistake that happen in different scales, but in different parts of nation building and state building project. Inside Afghanistan, those who follow Afghan news know very well that Kabul bank was collapsed. I think it was 2012, if I'm not mistaken. This hundreds of millions of dollars of Afghan people's money, just like a scheme robbed by a few elites who had good relation with foreigners and had businesses outside Afghanistan. Many other forms in civil society that is not very been like the focus of issues in Afghanistan. Even democracy promotion, human rights promotion turned to a project that elites wanted to grab projects from embassies and the founders and do something that were not sustainable in many ways. So a combination of these issues actually desalinated Afghans, especially rural areas, combined with other problems. And then robbed elections, frauds, and President Ghani came to power in 2014 when we thought, the election commission announcing how many votes he got. It came from a deal between him and his rival Abdullah, and then the second election and also parliament election. These rigged elections actually delegitimize the government and give good reason for insurgents to claim that they are at least clean hand. So then came another thing. Trump freed around 8,000 prisoners of Taliban. This all together actually dishearten Afghan people and discourage Afghan security forces to stand against Taliban when the leadership escaped the country. So this is a thing like this. And I wanted to say that for peace building, it is very important to see legitimacy as not an element beside other elements, but the main element to keep the support of grassroots people for the government who claim to promote values such as democracy, human rights, women's rights, freedoms, things like this. So legitimacy is at the basic. Hopefully I can return back to this issue, especially in case of Afghanistan further. But I want to say that many of these governments, states in the region that built by international support, they face the legitimacy problem. And this is the main issue is that international mechanism to oversee use correct and rightful use of resources is weak. Corruption exists in every aspects of life there in those countries, and in case of Afghanistan, but also there's no mechanism to answer them and to address these corrupt people. And accountability is important. If we claim that human rights are important, then there should be a guarantee and there should be punishment for perpetrator. The same is true about other values. So mechanisms of peace building needs to be improved to increase legitimacy and connection between people and the government. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. I'm glad you focused on corruption, because it's certainly, I think, been a big issue in the context of Afghanistan. It's a big issue, as you know, and as you mentioned, in the context of peace building more generally. And I think, as you said, the answers to the question of corruption are very few and far between at the moment. So hopefully we can come back to some of that, at least in the Q&A. Mark, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Tim, I appreciate you taking making the effort to organize this this panel. I think obviously it's very timely. I've been working on Afghanistan since 2001, since the international intervention started there. And it's been absolutely devastating to watch the collapse of the government and the return of the Taliban. As Tim said, my focus has always been on the security sector in Afghanistan and efforts by the international community to work with the Afghans to develop a new security sector. So that's what I'm going to focus on in my remarks today. I have to say, it was not a shock to me that the Afghan army and the wider security sector collapsed after the US neared the completion of its full withdrawal from the country. The writing has been on the wall for some time now. The security sector has been failing, has been slowly disintegrating in the country for some time. What did shock me, and truly shocked me, was the speed of that collapse. Half of Afghanistan's provincial capitals and Kabul fell within 10 days as the Afghan army and police simply melted away, in many cases, not even firing a shot. I expected this collapse to occur if the international community were to withdraw from Afghanistan, but I thought this was going to unfold over 2 or maybe 3 years, with the Taliban taking over gradually, district by district. I think few people could foresee this lightning advance of the Taliban and the collapse of the security forces and the government. Now, US leaders have heaped blame on the Afghan army for this tragedy, saying plainly that the Afghans weren't willing to fight for their country. This is ridiculous. 66,000 members of the Afghan security forces have died fighting the Taliban and other anti-government armed groups over the past 20 years, 66,000. A further 110,000 members of those security forces were injured during this period. To put this into perspective, 4,000 NATO and coalition forces have died during the same period, the bulk of which were American. The Afghan security forces have fought hard and bled for their country, But in recent weeks, those security forces have reached a breaking point. And in my remarks today, I'm going to discuss 6 factors that push the security forces, in my view, to that breaking point. The first one, and Ali just talked about this, was corruption, abuse, and mismanagement in the security sector. The Afghan army and police have been weakened by extraordinarily high levels of corruption. The US alone, over the past 2 decades, has spent $86 billion on building the Afghan army and police. I would say conservatively, about 20% of that was completely lost to fraud, corruption, and waste. And that, I would say, is a conservative estimate. And Ali mentioned this. If you want some examples that will make your hair stand up, take a look at the reports of the US watchdog, the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. It makes pretty grim reading for US taxpayers as well as Afghans. One of the most corrosive manifestations of this corruption was the problem of ghost soldiers or police. These are soldiers or police who existed on paper, but didn't actually exist in reality on the ground. This type of scheme allows commanders to pocket massive amounts in fraudulent salary payments for those non-existent personnel. So you've probably heard over the last couple weeks in the media how the Afghan army and police outnumbered the Taliban. On paper, they did. On paper, the authorized force size of the Afghan security forces was over 300,000. However, in reality, by the time the government fell, the size of the force was likely more like 50 to 70,000 troops. And this was partially because of that ghost soldier problem. By the time the Taliban reached Kabul, though, their force size almost assuredly exceeded that of the Afghan security forces. To illustrate the scale of this ghost soldier problem, in 2019 alone, 42,000 ghost security forces were removed from the government payroll. 42,000 out of that, just over 300,000 total. In Kandahar, Zabul, Helmand, and Uruzgan provinces alone, it has been estimated that 50 to 70% of the police actually don't exist, the police on paper. So this is obviously a big problem. And this numbers problem for the security forces is not just an issue of ghost soldiers. For several years now, the security forces have faced an exceedingly high attrition rate. An attrition rate means measures the number of personnel who leave the forces on a yearly basis. And that attrition rate in Afghanistan in recent years was about 20 to 30%. So just imagine 20 to 30% of the security forces are leaving and not coming back every year. This is driven by casualties, so some are simply killed or injured, and desertions. Now, according to one recent estimate that I saw, which is credible, the security forces were losing 5,000 personnel per month, while recruitment was only bringing in 300 to 500 on a monthly basis. So math doesn't lie. This was an unsustainable project and was bound to fail eventually. Now, the second issue is the flawed military reform strategy of the United States and the international community. The US was the lead donor for military reform, and it sought to create an army in its own image, in the image of the United States. And this was, the way they saw it, was going to be a technologically advanced professional army in one of the poorest countries in the world. It didn't seem, this is still one of the, it didn't seem to fit the context. The force was also intended to serve as an auxiliary for the United States in the war on terror, to subdue groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State if they pop up, as they did in the country. The approach they took was unsustainable, particularly economically unsustainable in every way. What I mean by that is the United States was creating a military the Afghan government was never going to be able to afford or sustain. They were covering almost the entire budget of this force. And, it would have required indefinite subsidies, massive indefinite subsidies from the United States to keep this army running. And even before the Taliban took power, there was only an agreement to continue to provide those subsidies into 2024. It would have likely continued beyond then, but at the levels that would need it to maintain this army, I think that is doubtful. The US just didn't try to build an army that fit the local context and the needs of the Afghan people. Rather, they created an institution that was deeply dependent on the US, particularly its air power, expertise, and cash. Another deficiency of the strategy, of the military strategy, was that it was almost entirely focused on combat capacity for frontline soldiers. So to push Afghans into this insurgency and counterterrorism fight. Little attention, almost, very little attention was provided to supporting structures and institutional development, like building the Afghan Ministry of Defense. And we saw this just now as the Taliban rolled across the country. One of the reasons Afghan units collapsed in many places was because of the inept logistical capacity of the Afghan security forces. They couldn't get food or supplies, particularly ammunition, to their various outposts and bases that were surrounded by the Taliban. If you can't supply your forces, they can't fight. So just to end on that, the problem was that the US tried to create a force that emulated the US Army and particularly the Army, rather than build an army that was fit for Afghanistan. The third factor is weak governance. In the last few years, there's been constant changes in security sector leadership in Afghanistan as the government has shifted new leaders in and out to try and arrest the growth in insecurity and the growing power of the Taliban. And so this has created instability in the security institutions. Moreover, as the government and the security sector leadership in Afghanistan, as they saw that the US and international withdrawal was inevitable, they were very slow to adjust their military and political strategy, particularly to redeploy Afghan security forces who were very stretched across the country. They should have done this earlier when it became clear that the US was leaving. And finally, I won't go into depth about this because I've already mentioned it, but the government failed to address corruption across the government. The Afghan government could better be described as a kleptocracy than it would be a democracy. And that was, funny enough, that was what President Ghani had promised to do. That was the main part of his platform. He was going to address corruption and waste, not only among Afghans, but among the international community as well, and was largely ineffective in doing so. The fourth factor is what was an effective Taliban strategy and use of soft power. So let me go into a little bit more detail about what I mean there. One of the reasons the Taliban were able to take so many areas without firing a shot is because they negotiated the surrender of Afghan security force units. So they worked through local elders and community leaders to negotiate with the Afghan security forces. They offered them amnesties and money if they abandoned their weapons and went home. And they were successful in many of these cases, a very successful approach. Secondly, their information operations deserve some credit. They were emphasizing Afghan government corruption and abuse, and they made their victory look like it was going to be inevitable. They were constantly claiming victory, even when they weren't victorious in particular battles. But it was creating the sense in Afghanistan like the Taliban victory was an inevitability. Third was intimidation. Over the last few years, there has been a campaign of assassinations against military pilots, police officials, government officials, and a range of civil society figures, including, of course, women and many other minority groups. This campaign of intimidation also sought to threaten the families of security force commanders to try and press them into surrendering to the Taliban, and this was effective. And finally, the Taliban militarily had done a good job of capturing key highways and border crossings over the last year. And this was had the effect of cutting off major cities and security force bases in the country so essentially to cut supply lines. It also gave the Taliban stable sources of revenue in the form of road tolls and customs duties. My fifth factor, and I'm coming to the end, so I apologize, but it takes some time to explain why 20 years went awry, but is the expedited US withdrawal. It was just too fast. The Doha agreement of the Trump administration between the Taliban and the US, as has been said by both my colleagues, rattled the Afghan government and gave the Taliban momentum. When President Biden confirmed that all US forces would be withdrawn by the end of August, the fate of the government was sealed. And I think a poignant example of how this withdrawal was too fast was Bagram Air Force Base. The US abandoned what was the epicenter of the US war in Afghanistan in the middle of the night without informing the local Afghan security force commander. They just left. Okay, this shows you how fast and disorganized in some ways this withdrawal was. The Afghans needed US air power to survive, but the US took that tool away for the most part from the Afghans as well, both for close air support, for operations, military operations, but also for resupplying missions. The Afghan Air Force, although it's made significant strides, was never going to fill the gap left by the United States. Finally is the lack of morale. We've heard a lot about this in the media, among pundits, and so on. All of the previous factors that I've mentioned here, the other five, all contributed to a devastating fall in morale among the Afghan security forces. The security forces, frankly, didn't trust their government, which they saw as woefully corrupt and incompetent. And in fact, what I've been hearing is that there's been conspiracy theories running rampant within the Afghan security forces that the Afghan government was planning to hand the keys to the kingdom, the country, over to the Taliban anyway. So faith in the government had already fractured. They saw average Afghan security force members saw their commanders living lavishly by pilfering salaries when many of them went unpaid for months and rarely saw their families. Soldiers and police fighting at the front lines against the Taliban faced chronic shortages of ammunition and food. Their US ally, whom they relied on heavily, abruptly left. They felt betrayed. And I think it's understandable to understand that feeling. Every year, the Taliban were taking more and more territory, and their victory did seem inevitable to many members of the security forces. Their families were threatened if they continued to fight what was looking like a losing cause. So I'd ask you, if you were in their position, what would you do? This was a very challenging situation. So what I would say to those who said the Afghans, soldiers and police gave up on their country, I would say, no, they gave up on a government that they believed failed them. So what are the larger implications? And I'm just going to take about 30 seconds for this, Tim, before you cut me off. Could it have been done differently? Yes, and I hope we can talk about that. But even if we take as an inevitability that the US was going to withdraw their military forces from the country, they could have done that differently. They could have had a longer drawdown over 2 or 3 or 4 years. They could have kept air power in the country, kept Bagram, so to provide cover for the Afghan security forces. Of course, they'd have to provide that indefinite economic support for the army they created. And they needed to put more political pressure on the Taliban and their regional allies, Pakistan and others, that could push the Taliban to negotiate in a meaningful way with the Afghan government. One thing that's clear from all of this, and this goes beyond Afghanistan, is the era of state building, of big international interventions, is over. And I can promise you that I've spoken to a number of people in governments, Western governments, who they don't even use the word state building, nation building anymore. That's dead. This Afghanistan will be a lesson that the lesson they've learned from Afghanistan, I should say, is that these types of grand interventions just don't deliver. The other thing that I think it will do, unfortunately, and this keeps me up at night, is embolden other extremist groups like the Taliban, who saw the United States and the West abandon this project and leave the Afghans in the lurch as they did. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Mark. I sympathize with the difficulty of getting all of this material in under 10 minutes. So let's go straight to Jalil to wrap us up. Jalil, go ahead.
I just want to introduce the acting government of Taliban, which was announced just yesterday. It could be an update of the situation, and also hopefully is helping to give us a broader picture of the conflict and the crisis that's going on in Afghanistan. And it is clearly show who is Taliban. When we are saying to this now acting government, it clearly shows that who is Taliban, but they have wanted and for what they fought for 20 years. But before to talk about this acting government, for information of my audience, I want to talk a bit about Afghanistan ethnic composition. Afghanistan is one of the most diversified country in the region in terms of ethnicities. There are about 14 ethnic groups that are recognized in the constitution, but 4 of them are the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan: Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, and Uzbeks. There is no accurate and official census of Afghanistan population, and also there is no official statistics about ethnicities, but roughly there are about 30 to 40% of Pashtuns, 20 to 30% Hazaras, around 30 Tajiks, 10 to 15 Uzbeks and Turkmens. And now let's jump to the acting government. The acting government of Taliban has 33 members, but all of them are not ministers, or they are not all in the ministry, or some of them are deputy ministers. Among these 33 members, 17 of them are UN sanctioned. At least two of them are in the FBI list or in the reward for justice. And 4 of them are former Guantanamo prisoners. And 0% of them are women. 100% they are Sunnis. 0% are Shia Muslims. And 0% are non-Muslims, including Sikhs. 0% are educated Afghans and experts. 0% of them are from previous government employees, from previous government, and 0% of them are Farsi speaker. Farsi is the most dominant language in Afghanistan. Farsi is something like English in Canada. But of course, there is like one person as chief of army. He's a Tajik Farsi speaker from Badakhshan. I will speak later. And there is one Uzbek as the second deputy of the prime minister or the leader of the government. And also, as I mentioned, there is one Tajik called Maulay Fasihuddin from Badakhshan. He is chief of army. And there are zero representation of the three largest ethnic groups, Hazaras, Uzbeks, Tajiks, in the cabinet and the minister level, except the two persons I just mentioned. 100% of the ministers, or 31 of these 33% are Pashtuns. And 50% of this government, this acting government is Durrani, and almost around 50% of them are Ghalzai. They are the two main tribes of Pashtuns. And 100% this government are from southern and eastern region of Afghanistan, and zero representation from other 5 regions of west, north, central part of Afghanistan, northeast, and southeast of the country. I'm not very specific, but around 60 to 70% of the cabinet is former Taliban who worked in 1990s. Almost 30% of new generation of Taliban, like Mullah Yaqub, son of Mullah Umar, or Sirajuddin Haqqani. And now, also I want to talk very briefly about the structure of previous government, or Ashraf Ghani government, in the days before his government was collapsed. Ashraf Ghani was an American Pashtun from Ghalzai tribe. His security national advisor, Hamdullah Muhib, was a British Pashtun Ghalzai. And head of administration office of the president was a Swedish Pashtun from Ghalzai tribe. And it was very famous, especially in last year, in recent months, they were called Republic of Three. When they were talking about Republic against Taliban or Imarat. And there's Ashraf Ghani and his two advisors, Fazli and Muhib, were controlling the entire government during at least past 2 years. And Muhib was in charge of the security departments, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interior, Intelligence Department. And Fazli was in charge of all civil departments, civil services. Even he was supervising the ministers. And from the security ministers, defense minister was a Ghalzai Pashtun, Asadullah Khalid from Ghazni. But very recently, like 2 weeks before the government was collapsed, according to Reuters reports, Biden called Ashraf Ghani to replace him with Bismillah Muhammadi. He's a famous commander from Panjshir. He led the anti-Taliban forces during 1990s. But Bismillah Muhammadi tweeted the day after Kabul was collapsed. He said, Ghani tied our hands from our behind, didn't allow us to fight Taliban, and he fled the country without any previous notice. And also, Minister of Interior during Ghani was a Pashtun, and he was obviously not a well-known security expert or general. And 4 commanders of army corps out of 7 were Pashtuns. And as Mark mentioned about mismanagement of security sector, Ghani fired hundreds of the most well-known and experienced generals, especially non-Pashtun generals, during the past 6 years. for example, he recruited like 2 girls that are at their 20s. One of them is like 25, 24 as Deputy Minister for Interior Ministry, and other one Deputy for Ministry of Defense. And Ghani constantly suppressed and disarmed the anti-Taliban and pro-government militants. Generally, Ashraf Ghani paralyzed the whole government institutions by transferring all powers of civil and security institutions to his own office, including central banks, Ministry of Finance. Even when he was signing or recruiting a entry-level job or junior staff in a remote area, for example, in Mazar, Bamiyan, or Herat, he was himself was ordering who should be that person. And finally, and after the Taliban government and Ashraf Ghani government, finally, I want to say or highlight who was representing Washington during the peace talk since it started in Doha. Of course, it was Khalilzad Zaghalzai from Mazar. And to wrap up here, I don't want to make a conclusion. I just wanted to share these facts and information with the audience. But obviously I can answer any questions, and I can address with more details if there was any question about the facts I shared here. And I just want to emphasize that the main context of conflict in Afghanistan is an ethnic conflict. I very much agree with Biden that Afghanistan has never been a united country. It was the most interesting thing I heard from Biden during past 2 months. But rather, Afghanistan is a disintegrated ethnics in an integrated nation. And to wrap up my discussion, what happened in Afghanistan was collusion between factions and fractions of one ethnic groups. Every other dimension of the conflict and elements of crisis interpretable and understandable in the context of ethnic composition of power in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thanks, Jalil. Thanks, Jalil. Lots there to unpack as well. So just a reminder, we've got about half an hour left. There have been some questions that have come in on the Q&A. Certainly welcome others. But let me start with a question that came in from Hugh Siegel, because it touches on this larger question of the future role of the international community, and particularly the West in Afghanistan. And his question is as follows. In view of the presence of the interim government of Taliban officials who are on terrorist watch lists with ties to Al-Qaeda and others, and with growing evidence of violence against women by the Taliban, why would the civilized world not assist the resistance through clandestine and special operations forces to make it clear to the Taliban, or that the Taliban have no international standing or recognition, and forcing both China and Pakistan to stop hiding behind diplomatic generalities? So I guess the wider question here is around what comes next in terms of how the international community and countries like Canada respond to the Taliban, right? Do we continue to refuse to recognize them? Is it inevitable that we need to work with them? Do we support the opposition, etc.? It's a big set of questions in early days yet, given that, as Jalil mentioned, the interim government has just been announced yesterday. But I wonder if we might have some preliminary thoughts on what's likely to unfold in the days and weeks with regard to the response.
So Hugh knows better than all of us the consequences of not negotiating with the enemy and the consequences of negotiating with the enemy. As a person who's been covering women's rights all these years in Afghanistan, of course, I want to say, keep them out, refuse to help them, cut off the money, drive them out. But then you've got this humanitarian crisis going on. If people are going to starve to death, and the Taliban would let them starve to death, do we need to interfere? And again, as Hugh would know better than anybody else, you can't find peace unless you find a way to negotiate with the enemy. So I think it's very tricky. And in the short term, what we're trying to get is safe passage for those people who are vulnerable, women journalists, judges, human rights workers, LGBTQ communities. And if we're trying to cut a deal with the Taliban, we'll give you food if you let these people out. So it's a tricky business. But one thing I'd like to say in closing this piece is we are all circling around the same story, that what we are doing does not work. It is time to review the way we decide we're going to help or interfere with troubles in other countries.
Other thoughts on supporting the resistance, working with the Taliban? There's a lot of dimensions to this question. Mark, can I ask you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, you know, I agree with Sally in the sense that if you have a full cut of international aid, this will cause tremendous suffering. Now, I think the hope was, and it was perhaps a naive hope, the Taliban were trying to telegraph that they've changed, that this is a Taliban 2.0, and that perhaps it would be open to a more diverse government. Well, that didn't happen, as Jalil said. Okay, you know, if anything, that was a very provocative government if you want to form any sort of relationships with the West. I think the Taliban are calculating that things have changed a bit from the 90s because they have pretty good relations now with the Chinese. You know, the leader of the Taliban met with the Chinese premier, you know, in Beijing. You know, so you have the Russians have supposedly been providing support to the Taliban during this whole process, which is a worrying dimension. The Iranians, even who have been enemies of the Taliban in the past, you know, have seen them, you know, enemy of my enemy is my friend type of situation. And of course, the Pakistanis have been continuing to interfere as they always have. So, you know, the Taliban are probably thinking to themselves, we're going to get aid from some of these other big allies, even if we don't get it from the West. That's to say they still, though, you know, have cooperated in some respects. So they certainly don't want to be the pariah state they have in the past. But I think the signals thus far are not good that the Taliban or have changed in any way. I would say in terms of clandestine operations, it's too early to say. I don't see Western boots on the ground. I'm not sure that would be a good idea anyways. But would you see financial and other types of support, providing weapons and so on, similar to how the Mujahideen were supported, you know, in the 1980s and 90s or the 80s? That's, you know, a possibility. But I think now, as has been said, the focus has to be is how we can avert a humanitarian crisis, which is already starting to unfold, and try and help people who want to get out. So I think right now, Western governments have to be very careful in how they're dealing with the Taliban, because they don't want a situation where they're going to shut any possible exits for people, not just citizens, but those who want to leave. So it's, yeah, it's a delicate situation, but I'm not very optimistic about the posture of the Taliban at this stage.
Can I ask Jalil or Ali on this one in terms of the broader international community? I mean, is it time to accept that the Taliban is the new government and work with them, or is there, from your perspective, would you say that there's merit to supporting the opposition, assuming there's sufficient opposition within the country to actually fight back against the Taliban?
I think Taliban is not a terrorist group in Afghanistan, but also it was encouraging other extremists all around the world. We are hearing many other terrorist groups around the world are cheering. And also, for example, Suhail Shaheen said, we will not leave Kashmir alone. We will help our Muslim Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And also there was many videos recorded recently in Afghanistan, and one of them was in Jalalabad. One of close friends of Bin Laden was in Jalalabad with the number of armored vehicles. And I think it would be very naive perception if we think that Taliban has been changed. And what I just shared about the government, it is clearly showing how they are thinking, what they are looking for. And then I'm guessing the ways the NATO allies will be back on war to terror, but this time, as Biden said, maybe they are not going back to build a nation, but they have to build local capacities as a part of foreign policy. And it is good to start as soon as they can, rather to be too late for them.
Jim, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Ali.
Yeah, Diane. Just I want to say something that's important for me. It's important as we see Taliban. They are not like a single hand or like one centralized one group. People have the same ideology. They have very dangerous terrorists inside them. That they many of their operations cause even hundreds of casualties in each of them. So but there are other that want to be traditionally they are people inside that are more like seeing ethnical issue are important for them, and also some of them are exposed to international. So it's just not a single, and it's very difficult to say what to do with this even this government formed was not expected for Taliban themselves. It's collapsed, and they came and they saw themselves in the middle of governance, seeing that they should do. We see very opposite and sometimes contradictory messages coming from Taliban. From one side, they always trying to assure Afghan people that they are keeping their amnesty and their they do not follow those who work with international forces or with the previous government, but also they wanted to see that show the Afghan people that media is there, women going to school, at least in big cities. At the same time, you see the dangerous people who wanted to impose their interpretation of Sharia on Afghanistan. In you can see that among the list of the officials, the interim government that produced the announced people are very from hardcore of Taliban. So this is a mix of messages that we receive from Afghanistan under Taliban, and we see that there are a generation that don't want Taliban. They have experienced a life that enjoyed some level of civil freedoms, political freedoms, economic freedoms, and engagement. There have been achievements by international presence in Afghanistan in 20 years. Now women at least dare to come to the street. You see pictures of women standing against the Taliban with Kalashnikov, saying that this is my right. So it's very important for me to deal with the Taliban in a way that keep as much achievement in civil society, in Afghan, like in the Afghan society, the capacity inside the government as much as possible, and also, like directing Taliban to at least to continue their holding the promises of giving basic and fundamental freedoms, and using this. I don't know how much Taliban will receive financially from Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, things like this. The biggest support from this country is that their silence. They kept silent about the Taliban return, and I'm not even sure at how economic pressure can actually affect the hardliners inside Taliban. So it's a delicate situation that merits a little bit of a complex response, gradual, and see what happens on the ground.
Sure. Thanks, Ellie. I see Sally's sort of struggling to stay with us here. I think maybe she's having some internet connections. She's back now. Ellie, you ended your comments by talking about the complexity of the issue. Can I add a little more layer to that? There's a couple of questions in the Q&A about the region and the kind of Afghanistan's near abroad, and what it means, what the withdrawal of the United States means in terms of the vacuum that it creates in terms of regional politics. And part of this comes back to what Sally said at the beginning about the looming economic crisis and how what the response to that will be, but also in terms of the political opportunities. Somebody asked about Pakistan, what its role has been through all of this, what it likely will continue to be in a new Afghanistan under the Taliban. China is looming in the background, right? How do you see the geopolitics of the region actually unfolding over the next, I mean, we can look at short-term, medium-term, and long-term, I suppose. But what are the dangers and opportunities, I suppose, of the vacuum left by the abrupt U.S. withdrawal?
All these countries from Syria and Yemen all the way up to the Caucasus are related because they all have Al-Qaeda playing among them. And the consequences of this collapse would lead to a tsunami of refugees. We're already seeing that. It would lead to an uptick in drug trafficking, that'll come, but it will also, I believe, lead to fairly significant terrorism. And when we wonder what's likely to happen, I think one of the things we need to consider is that it's possible that between ISIS and the Taliban, they will cook up an attack so horrendous that they bring the international community back in. I mean, it seems like a long shot, but things are so bizarre and being run by people who are so totally incapable of running a government. I mean, the Geneva Conventions mean nothing to them, nor does military conduct. So I think the future could get very dark that way.
Other thoughts on that? And sort of either the region general or the role of specific countries like Pakistan?
Yeah, I'll jump in again. I mean,
Go ahead, Mark.
I would say, and this gets back to one of the lessons of the last 20 years, which is really the failure to have a regional political process underway in Afghanistan, because this is a regional conflict as much as it was a domestic one. And so, you know, really an effort to bring all of those regional actors to the table. You know, obviously there was a lot of talk about putting pressure on Pakistan, which was warranted, but bringing Pakistan to the table, bringing the Central Asian states, Iran, the Gulf states as well, who have had an active role in Afghanistan, all of these actors who have used Afghanistan as their, have engaged in proxy competition in Afghanistan, bring them to the table to try and find some sort of regional solution to some of these issues, or at least a regional framework to address some of these issues, is one of one of those missing elements. Now, the problem is the United States, now that it's out, doesn't have a lot of leverage to be a big part of that process, NATO itself. So this process might go on without them, if it goes on at all. And then some of its vital interests, particularly to ensure that the region doesn't become, again, a staging ground for terrorist acts, will not necessarily be observed. Although that is the centerpiece of the Doha Agreement with the Taliban, of course, to prevent Afghanistan from being used by terrorist groups. So we'll see how that plays out. In terms of whether, China's an interesting case. China has made major investments in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And so, as well, of course, it's concerned about Uyghur militarism along the border in Xinjiang. And there are Uyghurs in Afghanistan itself, small numbers, but so there's always a fear of the Chinese that Afghanistan, again, could be a sanctuary for Uyghur militancy. So I think that they have incentives to provide support. I don't know what that support is going to look like, but to protect their investments as well as for those security reasons. On top of that, and this is sort of in the background that's been talked about for some time, that Afghanistan could be a very rich country with all of its mineral wealth, right? China, and some of these other countries in the region potentially over the medium and particularly the long term could be in line to take advantage of a renewed relationship with the Taliban regime. So, and of course, the Chinese, as we know, the Russians as well, are, view this in realpolitik terms. They don't care about how the Taliban treat their population. They're looking for stability in Kabul. So I see others want to jump in here. So I won't talk about Pakistan now, maybe in another intervention, but I'll let others get in.
Sure. Ali, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say that regional view of Afghanistan problem has been evolving since 2001. At the beginning, all countries in the region supported the new government, the Karzai government, hoping that the Taliban era, with all of its brutality and hard position that they had against Afghan people, ended. And this was the atmosphere in the region. But it gradually changed after Iraq War, and support to U.S. presence in Afghanistan reduced, and even there were increased theories of conspiracy, U.S. conspiracy in the region, and things like this growth. So, but especially with the Trump administration, he was following a real politics in foreign policy, doing something that were very unexpected, not only for enemies and rivals, but also from friends. Actually, turned other countries against U.S. You see that Iran went under very harsh sanction by Trump, just because he broke the deal that U.S. had with Iran on nuclear issue. The same is true about other issues. Trump policy, unfortunately, was a self-defeat for the United States in many directions, and especially in Afghanistan. So countries gradually pulled out their support to the U.S. presence and NATO presence, and even many of NATO members actually thought again that should we still follow the U.S. path in this country? So this is we see like a lack of support to the U.S. presence and U.S. government. Many things went wrong in Ghani government and Afghan policy inside. They're also believed. So the region now think and see that the West has been defeated, or at least withdraw from Afghanistan. The biggest support to Taliban is their silence. They keep silent. I don't know how much money Taliban received from other countries except Pakistan. Pakistan has been involving in this Taliban resurgence in many ways. It depends how Taliban works and how Pakistan can assure that the new Taliban, consider the concerns of other countries, China, Central Asian countries, Iran, and also it depends on how Taliban treat people, including minorities that Jalil mentioned, how treat them, and try to just improve how they want to manage their hardliners, or another case, hardliners dominate the government. So many factors determine the concerns of Afghan neighbors and the interests.
Yeah, still a lot of unknowns to become clearer in the days and months to come. We've only got about 10 minutes, a little less than 10 minutes now left. I'm hoping we can squeeze in a couple more questions before we wrap up. There's a couple questions about the UN and the role of the UN in a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. And I guess the question, maybe two questions here. One is does the UN still have enough credibility to be an honest broker in Afghanistan in terms of development work and humanitarian assistance? And the second question actually is around, and I've seen some of this myself in the last day or two, the side debate that's been running about the role of a future UN peacekeeping mission in Afghanistan, which I found quite interesting, if slightly fanciful. And I just wondered about the panelists' thoughts on the future role of the UN working with, through, around the Taliban in terms of providing support to Afghans. Jalil, do you want to start us off on this one?
I think it's now time for multilateral institutions, including United Nations, many other organizations, like including the European Union, European Commission, so Islamic Conference, and now it is time for them to intervene, both in terms of humanitarian crisis and also in terms of conflict itself. And as Alyssa suggested here, I think it's a good idea to think on peacekeeping mission from UN side. And also, everybody knows that it is a proxy government of Pakistan. Now, Afghanistan is every single Afghan, except the southern or eastern part of Afghanistan, every single Afghan believes their country has been invaded by Pakistan. And I think it is now time for Americans and the West, NATO, especially UN Security Council, to take a real action against Pakistan. Not just in terms of invasion, like what happened in Crimea, or what China is doing in Taiwan, but also in terms of Pakistan's role as a mediator between between China and Afghanistan. Now, they are working on the Silk Road, on the One Belt, One Road, and also working on the resources, but also I heard there are like hundreds of Chinese experts already entered to Afghanistan to control technologies, to control the social media, and they are Pakistanis are coming as support of Chinese technician to. As Biden prioritized his foreign policy to confront China, but already he lost the battle, or he left the battle for China in Afghanistan.
Just in the interest of time, I might see if anybody else wants to jump in on this UN question.
I would like to say something about the UN question.
Go ahead, Sally.
We've always had this us and them attitude with the UN. it's time we tackle this, because it's not. The UN is supposed to be all of us. Do they act as though they are all of us? Does the Security Council destroy that kind of all of us together action? I think it was time we had that conversation, because if anything has happened, this debacle in Afghanistan has shown how impotent the UN is. I mean, Deborah Lyons, who's head of the UN for Afghanistan, spoke out on August the 2nd. She laid the whole thing out. This is what is going to happen if we don't do the following. She was very clear, and she was very strong in her wording, and quite emotional about the size of the catastrophe that would follow. And nobody did anything about that. So I think her statement and the resulting action, the Ides of August, as people are starting to call it, show us that we have to have the UN. People say, oh, UN can't do anything, it's no good. We have to have it. It's the only way we can bring the world together. But we have to fix it so that somehow it's more effective.
Mm-hmm. Mark, quickly.
I just want to say very quickly that the UN mission on the ground is also very important as a source of intelligence on what's going on. I mean, you know, the politics of what's going on in the country, as also a line of communication with the Taliban regime that is seen as, you know, not neutral, but is not one of the Western intervening powers. So UN absolutely has a role. I agree that at this point you need consent for a peacekeeping mission, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, the facts on the ground are going to have to change dramatically before we see anything like that occur, nor could I imagine many countries eager to contribute troops to such a mission unless there's some sort of peace agreement, you know, which again, the Taliban have won, you know, so militarily. So I don't see that as a possibility.
I think peacekeeping troops would be seen as target practice for the Taliban, and certainly for ISKP.
Right. Can I ask one final question then, just in the 2 minutes we have remaining? It comes back to something Sally said at the beginning, and it's actually linked to the first question that was posed here by Sonia. All right, Sally, you talked about what we're doing isn't working in terms of peace building. We need to find another way. And her question was really around, does it mean getting everybody to sit around in a circle and find a mutually acceptable solution? I guess the question is, what's the future of peace? Is there a future for peace building in Afghanistan at this particular moment in time? And if so, what would it look like to do things differently? Maybe for you, Sally, and maybe you, Ali, as well, given that given your work is directly related to questions of peace building in Afghanistan. But how can we go forward? Maybe this is a question for another panel. But
I'll jump in very briefly,
please.
Because we don't know the answer. But the biggest problem is we haven't examined it, and it's time we said what we're doing isn't working. Now come to the table and figure this out. And I have all the faith in the world that the collection of people who care about these things can come up with a new way, and they can accept what we're doing doesn't work. Let's change it. And I think just like those scientists found the vaccine so quickly, we can find a better way.
For me,
Ali, you get the last word on this.
Yeah, I think for me, the future is very uncertain because different elements define the future. We cannot say of inevitabilities. You know, the people of Afghanistan, their wishes, their like, you know, especially the politics inside Afghanistan, as well as in this side, which is, we talk about Western countries, the issue of war fatigue and donor fatigue. Mark rightfully said that who wants to send soldiers, who wants to give like generous funding to any mission or other similar missions. So UN is the most legitimate actor in Afghanistan, and that they provide humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan, they can use their leverage, and many things can happen inside Afghanistan. People are now are not showing in the streets in thousands and thousands, but they're showing their resistance to Taliban rule, because currently their concern is security and economy. But soon this may happen significantly. Who knows what happens in these demonstrations and things. So it's a little bit difficult, but the future is open for different possibilities. Without doubt, humanitarian assistance continue to exist in Afghanistan, as UN already said.
Okay, I think I just got a note that that Sally needed to log off, so I think we've lost her. I see Mark's hand up though. Maybe I'll.
Yeah, could I just make a 10-second intervention?
Go ahead.
A lot of some of these problems, they had their origins back to the beginning of the process, the Bonn Agreement, and so on. I mean, Lakhdar Brahimi has talked about, for instance, the failure to engage the Taliban early on when they were in a weakened position as the original sin of the Bonn process. It was a victor's peace. It was not a true peace agreement which brought everyone to the table. So that's number one. You need an inclusive political settlement that didn't exist in Afghanistan. Secondly, and this is my final point now, there's many more things I could say, but a lot of these structures in the state building process were imposed on Afghanistan. You know, for instance, in the army, when I was in Afghanistan talking to people, this was not the army, the structure of the army many former military officers, people wanted, but it was imposed by the donor, the United States. And so, Tim, you're the world expert on ownership. There was a lack of ownership on certain aspects of this state building process where, you know, this has to be a process that is driven, owned, and directed by the Afghans with international support. But in many respects, the Afghans were in the back seat while the donors were driving the car. And that was part of the problem.
Right. Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to end this on a note of local ownership. But we should end it because we're after time. But before we wrap up, let me extend my thanks to all of you, and to Sally, who has needed to sign off to go to another engagement. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank Joanne Weston, who's been in the background of all of this, making it all function technically, and has ensured that it has gone smoothly. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I have a feeling this probably won't be the last time we have a conversation about Afghanistan and the future of Afghanistan and the geopolitical consequences of what's happened over the past few weeks, but at least hopefully we've given people some things to think about going forward. So thank you all, and wish you a good start to the academic year for those who are teaching and those who are studying, and for the rest, we'll be in touch again.